Welcome to the Center for Strategic and International Studies. My name is Heather Conley. I direct our Europe, Russia, and Eurasia program here at CSIS. We are delighted to be able to give you a window into what I considered an extraordinary virtual dialogue last fall, which brought together US experts, arms control experts, with their Russian counterparts for a series of virtual dialogues that looked at US-Russian strategic stability. Clearly, we had a lot of focus on the potential extension of the New START treaty, but our dialogue looked at much more than that. It looked at areas, new technologies that are outside the arms control regimes today. It looked at doctrine, military strategy. It looked at the lack of trust between the United States and Russia, and then finally look towards the future. What would a new arms control architecture look like if once the New START treaty was extended? How would we build that? So as we began this conversation, I couldn't be more delighted to invite two participants of that dialogue to join with us in this conversation. Of course, they're giving their own views about their own thoughts and not representing others. But we thought the best way to give you this window is to actually allow you to hear from the two participants themselves. Let me welcome and introduce them to you. First, I'm so delighted that we have Amy Wolf joining us. Amy heralds from the Congressional Research Service, which is an arm of the Library of Congress, where she's a specialist in nuclear weapons policy in the Foreign Affairs, Defense, and Trade Division. Amy provides Congress with information, analysis, and support on issues related to US and Russian nuclear forces and arms control. She's an author of many studies that I know we at CSIS lean on as well for great information, as do congressional staff and members of Congress. We also are delighted to have with us Andrei Babitsky, a senior research fellow at the Institute of International Studies at Imedno University of the Russian Foreign Ministry. He's also a consultant at the PIR Center, a member of the Deep Cuts Commission, and an expert at the Valdai Discussion Club. I think it's also important to note that this dialogue was in great partnership with our friends and colleagues at the Moscow-based PIR Center. They were an indispensable partner as we brought together this dialogue, and we thank them, of course, for their support. So Amy, Andrei, welcome, thank you. Let's roll up our sleeves and let's get started on the New START treaty. Let me begin by saying when we began this dialogue in the fall, we were not entirely sure how the New START treaty would be extended. Both sides felt confident, the political signals were there that it would be extended, but we weren't sure how long. Would it be 5 years? Would it be just 1 year? Would there be conditions placed on that? But today we know it is an unconditional 5-year extension. As Andrei notes in a recent piece he wrote for the Carnegie Moscow Center, that was the easy part, extending. The hard part is, what do you do with those 5 years? How do you rebuild trust and confidence and strategic stability? So with that question, Amy, I'm going to turn to you first for your thoughts on not only how we got to the 5-year extension of the New START treaty, but how do you structure and format this to make these 5 years useful? Over to you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Heather. Thank you for having me both for the dialogue in November and December and here this morning. When we were moving forward towards the New START extension, there were a number of different options for a path that could be taken. The previous administration was looking strongly at a very short-term extension linked to other conditions on mostly Russian, but US and Russian forces as a way to move the arms control dialogue ahead by getting START out of the way and moving forward. There were others who thought we should have a short-term extension and start the dialogue after extending New START, using the short-term extension either as leverage or as a window to structure the dialogue. The administration, when it extended New START last week, made it quite clear what its view was, and I'm going to quote the State Department release that Secretary Blinken put out. He said, the United States will use the time provided by the 5-year extension to pursue arms control that addresses all of its nuclear weapons We will also pursue arms control to reduce the dangers from China's modern and growing nuclear arsenal. So basically, instead of trying to leverage New START extension on getting Russia and China to agree to those things first, the administration has decided to take the issues we need to address in New START off the table, keep the predictability, keep the limits, and then incorporate these other issues. So the question becomes, how do you do that? Which is what we did a lot in the dialogue. And there's not a lot of answers yet from the administration on what they intend to do. But within the dialogue, we looked at some of the problems of structuring a dialogue with Russia. China, I'll set aside. We can talk about that later if you want to. But the participants here were Russia and the United States. And there are a lot of issues that both the United States and Russia have put on the table for arms control in the past. So if we're going to do that in the future, there is a question of what the table looks like, what the room looks like, and what issues are on that table. It became clear as we were talking that both sides know what their issues are that they want to put on the table. They're familiar to everyone in the arms control community. Russia's concerned about US missile defense. The United States is concerned about Russia's non-strategic nuclear weapons. There are other questions about force structure, new weapons that Russia's developing, new weapons that the United States is developing. One of the concerns was that if we tackle them all in a single discussion, we're not going to get anywhere. That either we will sit down the way we have on occasion over the last few years and just outline our lists of things to talk about without actually making any progress in the talks. And then after we've talked about what we want to talk about for a couple of days, we go home. So there's the question of how to expand the conversation and actually make it more substantive. There's also the issue of having too many things on the table. We know what the issues are coming in. We know, and we talked about this in the dialogue, what the range of other concerns might be, whether it's space or cyber or AI or hypersonic glide vehicles. The numbers of things that we could talk about in a dialogue is growing. So if you try and do it in 2 days at one table, all you're going to do is sit there and list. You're not going to resolve anything. So that was one of the questions we dealt with pretty frequently in the conversation. How do you do this? Do you have multiple tiers or multiple tracks of conversation? And I don't want to speak for anyone else in the dialogue, but I think the general agreement was multiple tracks may be the way to go, mostly because you have different expertise, different issues, and in some cases, issues are pretty ripe for formal arms control, whereas, should we talk about limits and behaviors, limits and numbers, definitions, whereas other issues like AI or cyber are still at the beginning, the starting point of a cooperative discussion. So the idea of what to do next is not just what should we talk about, but how should we talk about it? And what should the end goal be of those talks? It's not always formal treaties. It could be just further dialogue. There are a lot of areas where the United States and Soviet Union cooperated during the Cold War in things that weren't treaties. So we all are kind of sitting here at the beginning of this process, trying to figure out how to rebuild our muscle memory for having broader discussions. And we did a lot of that in the dialogue in November, December, and either fortunately or unfortunately, we didn't reach any conclusions. So we now know what the problem is. And we're looking to the administration and the US and Russian administrations to figure out how to actually put this together.
Well, thanks, Amy. Well, I think through the dialogue, I hope we gave both governments some new ideas. And Andre, I want to turn to you because it's exactly to Amy's point of how do you organize and how you prioritize. 5 years seems like a long time, but in arms control, it's never enough because of the complexity of issues. And as Amy noted, there's so many issues, but you had some specific ideas that I hope you're willing to share on how to think about the organization and some of the sequencing of all the range of issues that Amy mentioned. So Andre, let me turn the floor over to you for your thoughts.
Thanks, Heather, and thanks for having me and also co-organizing this very important, very interesting dialogue. I'll just would like to start with saying that it's really good that we extended a New START, and not only we did extend the treaty, we extended it without much pain, because it wasn't clear even when Biden was inaugurated, that's the way how it would go. You know that some people in the Biden administration, including Victoria Nuland, who was going to be nominated for Undersecretary for Political Affairs, advocated for extending for 1-2 years and then using this as a leverage for engaging Russia. So once the decision was made, it was in a sense quite good. And also when Russia reciprocated by, in very short time frame, ratifying the law of extension of New START, which only took 1 day, this is good in the sense that Russia and the US can still agree on things and they can deliver on their promises. That wasn't always the case in Russia-US relationship. And if you remember, for example, President Putin meeting with President Trump in Helsinki, they had a summit and there was a lot of deliverables, decisions, agreements, and 0 of those then happened because one side just could not deliver on its promises. So it's good at least that we see that both Biden administration and Russian presidency can deliver. Generally, I would have to say that we have a very bad track record on arms control. And sometimes you hear people being pessimistic, but you should always distinguish the real problems we are facing as arms control is changing, as new technologies appearing. And also this bad track record is just make people stop believing in arms control. The last time we actually had arms control negotiations between Russia and the United States was 10 years ago with New START. If you look at the Republican administration, that would be much further. That was early 2000 with SORT, which wasn't actually really negotiating and really a treaty, which means that the previous time it was in the early 90s with, START 1 ending. And that's like, 30 years back. In Russia, again, the New START was negotiating the President Medvedev. So then again, President Putin, last time he was in charge of negotiating an arms control treaty, was again with SORT. So that it's been a while. And some good news are highly welcome. So New START extension is good, at least on this front. So it opens up a little bit the sphere and we can start talking about maybe other things. There are some signals that Open Skies Treaty could be back in the game and the sides could look into this. And obviously the Biden administration is looking into it at the moment. So there is that. On how we move forward, you're totally right. We don't have 5 years. Next US presidential elections are in 2024. If the administration changes, we can pretty much throw away everything we've been talking about for those years. So that shortens the period. Then normally you don't have much happening before the elections, especially you're not negotiating the treaties, even despite the fact that Trump administration tried to do exactly that. So in reality, we have very little time and we don't have time to waste, which brings me to the point I want to make is that we really should start those negotiations as soon as possible. I don't think we have time for US, for example, to go and to do its review of strategic documents, which would take a couple of years and only then start talking. We should start talking now. If I were in charge, I would send people to Vienna or to Geneva or to what have you tomorrow, because if you wait for all those documents to be produced, then they set the positions in stone. Then it makes it much harder to negotiate because basically we already have those framework from which you cannot really deviate. The earlier we start, the more flexible we are, the more perspectives for success there is. On how you can frame it, in Russia now there is this term strategic equation, which is basically something that Russia has proposed to Trump administration and it's now transferred to Biden administration, as far as I understand. It's basically to look into all of the factors which influence the strategic stability, offensive arms, defensive arms, aka missile defenses, and conventional arms to a certain extent, and how they all interact with each other and how they all influence each other. Within this framework, then you can decide how you codify all of this. You can have treaties, you can have political agreements, you can have executive agreements, you can have political understandings, which would be covering all of this. So I think this makes sense because we have a lot of things on our plate. We're not sure how all of this will go. We understand there are a lot of limitations. For example, limitations on the US side, whether the Congress would want to ratify some of those things. So we are at the beginning of a very long and a very complicated path, but we should start moving on it as soon as possible.
Andre, thank you so much. I just want to remind our audience, please submit your questions. There's a green button on our event page. We want to bring you into this conversation and incorporate your questions. So please send us your questions. Amy, let me turn to you because, I think that the challenge of this conversation, as you noted, all of the issues on the table, Andre just noted, there is an interaction between offensive, defensive, and conventional weapons. In fact, we saw that in our dialogue. It was even the conventional versus the nuclear. It was very difficult to unpack their broader effect. So we have 5 years. We know the New START, at least the dimension that will stay. What do we prioritize? What do we do first? How do we start building confidence? Because what was clear during dialogue, there is just no trust between the United States and Russia. US officials believe that Russia's repeated violations of previous arms control treaties, like the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Agreement, that they can't trust Russia. And Russia does not believe that the United States ever acknowledges its concerns, as in missile defense for the last decade. So where do you start? How do you start? What do you focus on to build that trust?
We had a lot of discussions about trust in the framework last November and December, and the main disagreement we had was trust necessary? And there are those who believe that you can't even sit down at the table to start having these discussions if you aren't in a good political place where you can trust each other. If we wait for that, as Andre said, we're going to be waiting too long. So what is it that we need to have trust in? One could argue we need to have trust in the honesty and fidelity of our negotiating partners. But I don't think that's necessarily true. I'm not a diplomat. I'm not trained as a diplomat, but I am pretty certain most diplomats don't believe you need to trust the person on the other side of the table before you can talk to them. It's a matter of trusting the process rather than the people. So if the United States and Russia believe that cooperating through discussions and concrete steps to reduce national security dangers or nuclear dangers or to mitigate risks is in both nations' national security interest, that's where you start. You start that with the fact that both sides trust that the process can make progress. If you don't trust that the process can make progress, that you're only going to sit down and continue to have these cross-talking conversations, then it's worth sitting down, but you don't trust you'll make progress. So you start from the perspective that everything has a place on the table. If the United States walks into the room and says, we are never going to talk about that issue, whatever the issue is, whether it's missile defense or prompt global strike, and the Russians walk in and say, we're never going to talk about non-strategic nuclear weapons or our nuclear doctrine, then we're not going to make any progress. It's trusting that you can put the issues on the table. So if you begin with the process and recognize that putting an issue on the table does not predetermine the outcome of that issue being on the table. So in that sense, you get started by being open-minded. I don't have any opinions on what 100 issues we should put on the table, but I do know if we refuse to put critical issues on the table, either side does, we're not going to make progress. So as far as moving forward, again, you need to ask yourself, should everything be on the same table? Should we start with different tracks? If you can organize it in such a way that it's not all or nothing, that it's not everything's on the table or we won't come to the table, or we're not going to put any of that on the table, so there's no reason to come, then at least you get started. As Andre said, there may be some benefit to starting even before you know what you want the outcome to be. But the whole idea of building trust is not trust in that you'll do what we want you to do or we'll do what you want us to do, but trust in that both sides will benefit. And that actually might be a pretty big step, because there is a loss of the muscle memory. As Andre said, it's been a long time since we've had an arms control negotiation. The view that cooperating to mitigate nuclear risks is in our national security interests is not universal. So that may be where you start. The building trust is in the process, not in the outcome.
Thanks, Amy. We're going to make sure this arms control negotiation does not go to the dogs, and we're glad your dog.
I'm sorry, he's going to ask for that treat occasionally. In the
That's end. Okay. We approve. We approve. Andre, let me turn to you, because where do you prioritize? Again, Amy, your point on process is really important, but we've got to get some success. Where do we prioritize? And I want your thoughts on that. And then I want to start to segue into the new technologies. One of the sources of this lack of trust is the development of new weapon systems. You mentioned them, hypersonics. We don't have a framework for addressing those, and New START does not address those new technologies. Cyber attack on nuclear command and control systems, something that came out as a huge priority for both sides, that we've got to put some boundaries around this. Where do you start, and can you build confidence from that prioritization through this extension process?
So I just want to add something to what Amy just said. If we're going to wait when the political situation is good between other countries, we probably wouldn't be able to start, because we are in a bad place to start with, politically wise, and this probably will get worse for US-Russian relations as a whole. And we are witnessing this in the human rights sphere, where US and Russia has obviously divergent views, and this divergence will probably even grow, which is when I see that apparently there is no attempt on the US side to link arms control to detente with Russia. I think it's good because it's realistic. You don't really have arms control only when you're trying to mend your relationship with a country. That's not how it worked. We normally had arms control when we were trying to make detente at the restart and the new start, then detente in the 60s and 70s, which went with all of those treaties. But unfortunately, we probably have to try to be more realistic in where we are and where we're moving. When you ask from where should we start, this actually brings us to the whole concept of arms control and why we're having arms control in the first place. I would say we need to start from what is militarily important and what is important for our national security. So obviously, one thing I would talk about is INF range systems, which have not disappeared after US withdrew from the INF treaty. And the problem is still there. It's just people don't talk about it anymore because it's out of the news. So Russia has proposed to, it's actually announced a moratorium on deployments in the regions where the US has not deployed its systems. And there was a number of, versions. The latest version was that Russia is willing to include the missile in question, the missile for which US withdrew from the treaty, 9M729 missile, which US claims is a violation, and Russia never acknowledged. Russia said, anyway, we are willing to include it in the moratorium, and we are also willing to talk about the verification provisions. So presumably, if this whole INF issue was important enough to leave the treaty, then presumably it's still important enough, and that could be one of the things we can start with. Again, another thing which is quite important for both of our countries is space security. So Russia is concerned with US plans for outer space. US is concerned with Russian plans for deploying anti-satellite weapons. And this is actually was one of the few topics which under Trump administration was, I wouldn't say moving, but at least there was some meaningful dialogue and meaningful contact. It wasn't as high on the agenda as other things, but at least it was a place where the both sides had interest. So it opened possibility to get some kind of agreement. So those, in my view, would probably be pressing issues for which you can then start talking, because diplomacy is an art of getting out of proposals your opponent puts on the table something you really want. Because when US said, okay, we want to talk about non-strategic nuclear weapons, Russian response could be, okay, so INF range systems are non-strategic nuclear weapons. Let's talk about them and let's include them in those talks. So I think there are ways to bring positions of at least what should be on the table closer together. If we can then make some kind of progress, or if it could be some fast progress, I'm not that sure. It would be, again, helpful if we were combining those negotiations with some sort of joint statements, like nuclear war cannot be won, should not be fought, and that, maybe we can do it in P5, maybe we can do it bilaterally. It will also help us with the review conference, which is ongoing, but basically sending out some good signals that there is joint understanding on arms control in one way or the other would be at least not impeding our negotiations, if not helping them.
Well, Andrei, that remark about the statement certainly came forward, either reaffirming Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev's statement, or doing something in the P5 context. Which brings me, Amy, to a question. We had a focused discussion on doctrine, and really thinking that has the United States and Russia shifted in their views about the use of nuclear weapons, particularly tactical, non-strategic, regional theater nuclear weapons, that in some ways this maybe grows from the fact that we have not held a durable arms control dialogue, that we're both sort of getting a little more, these are my words, comfortable, a little bit more lax in our public conversations about these, where we really need to remind ourselves that what we are talking about and the importance of it. So help us think through, are you getting questions, particularly after the US nuclear posture review, that the United States is changing its view, and perhaps how others see Russia's doctrine, its exercising of use of nuclear weapons? And then Andrei, I'll turn that question right over to you. Amy, please.
From my perspective, from where I sit, I can see the broad-based debate about whether or not Russia has changed its doctrine and whether or not the United States has changed its doctrine. Both sides would tend to say in their public statements, no, we haven't. We're just nipping and tucking and adding and subtracting, that nuclear weapons are there to deter. We don't want to fight a nuclear war. But there are views along the spectrum, I would imagine in Russia, and I know there are in the United States, about whether or not nuclear war is, or nuclear use is something that either escalates or de-escalates a conflict. And this is not new. I mean, we've heard it a lot in the last few years, but this has been going on. Well, we could take the debate back to the Cold War and the thoughts of war in Europe, but analytically, the question of what role for nuclear weapons in limited nuclear conflicts and regional conflicts has been going on for a long time. I think a big part of the debate over the last few years has been a focus on what I like to refer to as the hardware side of it. People have looked at weapons systems, deployment patterns, and said that could be used for more proactive use of nuclear weapons. And that's been true on both sides. The debate has noticed that both countries seem to be incorporating nuclear weapons that they could be seen as more useful. But as you mentioned, the real debate is not about what the hardware is, but what the software is. What people believe use might be is as much about doctrine, employment guidance, reassuring the allies, the things that are not visible to the public, to most of the debate. And therefore, people sitting on the outside looking in really can't resolve what the plans are. So when we had these conversations during the meetings last fall, there was some fireworks where people would say, that's just not how we would do it. And people would say, but that's what we've seen you doing. And there's really no way to resolve that. And I think the best answer I have about what's going on is neither the United States nor Russia is willing to rule anything out. And the absence of ruling things out makes some people believe they've been ruled in. And I don't know how you have a public-facing discussion on that without trying to limit hardware, because no matter what the public statements are, and I tend to be out of the mainstream on believing this, I really, really am fond of parsing the words in declaratory policy. Having a statement that nuclear war cannot be won and should not be fought, all very nice window dressing, but it's not, and I really enjoy parsing those statements, but it's not an effective way to get into the use guidance on nuclear weapons for either country. And you can't do that in a track 2 discussion. You can't get into what the use guidance is, and I'm not sure it's really useful. So again, it gets to the point of when you sit down at a table to have these strategic stability conversations, are there ways to build trust through that process that the words might have some effect, that the weapons deployments have meaning? It's entangled in all the other weapon systems, processes. Hypersonic glide vehicles, how would you use them? Can you use them differently? You know, the conversations will help disentangle the use guidance from the declaratory policy. But the debate, the way it's been going for the last few years, focuses so hard on the hardware that there's no room for discussions about the software. And I don't know how to resolve that, because there will always be a divide. But at least if we are having conversations that don't keep anything off the table. Andre's point on INF is a perfectly good example. The United States' view for the last few years is we are out of the INF treaty, therefore there's nothing to talk about. Russia's view is, but wait a minute, there's a lot of stuff to talk about. Talking about INF missiles doesn't mean we're getting back into a treaty. It means we're talking about INF missiles. So again, the concept of having a process where you can put things on the table, whether it is specific weapon systems and what concerns those raise about your doctrine, or whether it is the specific doctrine and why you are concerned because of the weapon systems, at least if you are having a dialogue, you can raise those issues. And if the dialogue allows things to be put on the table without presuming what the endpoint is, it might relieve some of these tensions. You might actually make progress.
Well, I would argue, turning to you, Andre, that in some ways, speaking on the US side, the INF violations and then the changes in the US nuclear posture, they all began to snowball. It was that lack of trust over doctrine and overuse, particularly watching exercises, watching weapon systems. That's what helped instill that lack of clear trust from the US. Do you think Russia's doctrine has changed, or we're just not familiar as we should be in understanding it with, as Amy mentioned, the hardware?
So when you look at the doctrines, both at the US, nuclear posture, the latest under the Trump administration, and to a certain extent to the foundations of the Russian Federation policy on nuclear deterrence, which was released last year, or the year before that. The COVID, just, you know, mixing all of the years. There is this feeling that deterrence is a good thing. And since you can deter some things, you might want to deter more, and you can just, you know, spread out and name other things which you don't like, and then your nuclear weapons will deter your adversary from doing all of those things. I'm not sure that's how it works. I'm not sure that's an effective approach, but it seems that's the approach which is happening. And the people would say, yeah, we're not changing it. Like always been like this, and we just maybe specifying a little bit things we haven't specified before, because we never said exactly what would constitute things which we are deterring you from. Now we are telling you that. But in reality, you see the spreading out of this thing. Emmy had a great point about ambiguity in military doctrines. Military doctrines are always ambiguous. You don't want to tell exactly what you're going to do, because you're afraid that then the adversary would understand that it can do everything else without being punished. That's why you keep some of the ambiguity. But there's always planned ambiguity, which you put there specifically so that your adversary wouldn't feel itself too comfortable. And there is unplanned ambiguity, which is just your wording, which you put there and you thought it was very specific, but then on the other side, people interpret it differently. And this is probably the main point for track one. I would suggest discussions when you can ask and say, like, here, what you are saying here, is this ambiguous because you plan it to be ambiguous and that's a fair answer, or it's just, you can explain it to us? And from what I've heard in Moscow, even the negotiations, consultations which were happening as the Trump administration in strategic stability talks, they included military officials from Russia and the United States, including some high-level officials. And from what I've heard, those were very, enthusiastically received in Moscow, because finally high-level military officials could sit down and talk, and not the people who are military diplomats, but including some of the people who make decisions about targeting, about nuclear employment. And they found a lot of interesting things and clarified some of those things. Unfortunately, since pretty much 2014, we don't have regular military-to-military dialogue between our militaries. I hope this might be changing under the Biden administration, but yeah, I'm not sure. I would love to for that to change. So I can explain you how nothing in Russian military doctrine, especially on the nuke employment, has changed in years, and basically the basic principles are the same. But yeah, if we can have some kind of dialogue between our militaries on those subjects, that would be perfect.
Andre, thanks so much. Let me turn now with a wider lens to the future of the arms control architecture. And while it is clear that US-Russian strategic stability is absolutely necessary for that global arms control architecture, it's insufficient. China has to be brought into that conversation. In fact, that was one of the reasons, in some ways, that the New START extension talks were in part delayed. It was a reason for the US decision, among many, to withdraw from the INF Treaty. So we have China as a factor. Of course, our dialogue maintained the focus on the bilateral component. And clearly, as this conversation has illustrated, there is plenty just on that bilateral agenda, but it's not only the agenda. How do we think about China? Some of the elements in the dialogue we talked about, that's that P5 statement, broadening this conversation out, because we also have our US allies, France and the United Kingdom, also have a voice on this as well. So how do we think about China moving forward, as the United States and Russia are going to be addressing their agenda? Amy, let me start with you, and then I will turn to Andre.
Sure, thanks. It's interesting because the discussion about China, just going back 2 or 3 years before the Trump administration declared that we couldn't have any future arms control unless China signed on to New START, and we all went, wait, that won't work. We have not had an arms control discussion without mentioning China since then. So they did a very robust job of changing the conversation. And you can't have an arms control discussion anymore without considering how to bring in China. And the range of opinions on how to bring in China is pretty broad. I mean, a piece came out from the Atlantic Council just this week, which argued for 3 alternatives for how to have a trilateral arms control treaty like New START with China in the treaty, which is one end of the spectrum and one that seems, for most people in the discussion, undoable because of the difference in the numbers of Chinese weapons from US and Russian weapons. But that is one end of the spectrum. There are people who would argue that at the other end of the spectrum, we should just have, informal strategic stability talks with China to keep them on board and start getting them used to the idea while the United States and Russia work out their issues for everything else we've been talking about. But there is a middle ground too that includes strategic stability talks at either 2 bilateral sets, one United States, China, one United States, Russia, or a trilateral set, or even trying to expand the process and progress in the P5 so that it's a more robust discussion. And there are lots of opportunities to try and bring issues into those frameworks that are more robust than just, well, let's have strategic stability talks while we wait until we get to the point of nuclear limits. Arms control doesn't have to be all about formal treaties with nuclear limits, limits on nuclear forces. There are many different mechanisms that we've used over the years to build confidence, increase transparency, and reduce the risk of misunderstandings. So the INF case, again, is a really good example. There are several analysts out there who think the next step in INF should be a way to bring China into a trilateral agreement on either limiting the numbers or addressing the deployments of intermediate range missiles. That has its pros and cons. The pro, obviously, is that was one of the United States arguments for why we should get out of INF. The cons, well, China has great value for these missiles and it's unclear whether they'd be willing to talk about them. But there are another number of different mechanisms to use to increase transparency, build confidence, and again, build muscle memory for the Chinese who have participated in multilateral agreements, but not bilateral or trilateral. And even, as you mentioned, expand the P5 process so that the British and the French have a voice. And then the mechanisms you use don't have to be formal treaties that limit weapons. You could have cooperative activities. You could have talks on risk reduction measures. You can have confidence building measures. So the fact that the discussion about arms control can't happen without China in the mix is a big change over the last couple of years, but really does open the aperture for the next 5 years on what is arms control. And if we're going to bring China into the discussions, as the State Department statement last week said, and as the Trump administration insisted, and as the Russians have agreed that it's China's decision, but it would be nice to happen, there's a wide range of different ways to do that. And that's one of the things that we've extended New START, what do we do next discussion really has to consider. And I think everybody has thought about it for the last 2 years, so it'll be interesting to see what the administration decides to do next. Not my job to figure that out.
Thanks, Amy. Andrei, what is the sense in Moscow? I mean, clearly the Russian government didn't feel it was its job to bring China to the table in Vienna when then Special Envoy Marshall Billingsley very much wanted China to be there. But I hear sometimes mixed signals about what China means in the broader arms control conversation from Russian scholars. So I would really welcome your perspective and how you think the Russian government is going to manage bringing China into this broader equation of arms control.
First of all, Amy, you should come to Moscow. Here you can talk about arms control without bringing China in. It's like, we are good. Yeah, just a side note on the P5. So the people who actually work on the P5 are much less enthusiastic about its potential from my experience. They're like, probably this format is not saving you from all of the problems you're having. The biggest problem with bringing China in is that China doesn't want to be brought in, and it's really hard to bring someone who doesn't want it. again, I'll probably circle back to where we started. We are in quite bad relations between Russia and the United States politically. We are also in this era of new great powers competition, which probably was not rescinded under the new administration. So we're still in the great power competition. And, Russia and China probably are not on the US side in this great power competition. So don't expect Russia to do anything to bring China if that's what US want and China doesn't want. There is generally a broader question, which I'm not sure why would United States want to have trilateral arms control, and what exactly is this bringing to the United States benefits. And I've been saying it to a lot of my US colleagues. Frankly, I would love to see trilateral US, Russia, China arms control, because China and Russia would be, teaming together against the US, and they'll probably get a better deal if they're doing it together, because Russian and Chinese concerns are quite similar. It's missile defense, it's space, it's other things. So if you have not only Russia sitting at the table, but also 1.3 billion people of China, that looks good. Bring it on. I would love to see that happening. It's a good question if the Biden administration is even considering this trilateral arms control, or they'll be looking into what kind of problems do they actually having with China and how you can solve some of those. Because frankly, this whole let's bring China into strategic nuclear arms control seemed like we want to compete with China on all fronts, and we don't have much instruments for it, and this is one instrument more, so let's bring them in strategic arms control. China has very few strategic nuclear forces. It's not a strategic nuclear threat to the United States. Why do you treat it as a strategic arms control problem? What exactly are you trying to solve here? If the United States is trying to solve Chinese intermediate range missiles, which are a big asset in South China Sea next to the Chinese homeland, that's not strategic arms control problem. That's maybe even a conventional arms control problem or general military balance problem. But trying to shoehorn it in this framework, which was built for different reasons in different period, doesn't seem to be working that way or that well. So yeah, for Biden administration, I would just advise them to figure out what is their problem with China, and if there indeed is a real nuclear problem, then address it probably bilaterally.
Great, thanks so much, and thanks again to our audience for sending in some great questions. I want to urge you to continue to send those questions in for the last few minutes. We'll bring that in. I want to pull a thread, I think, Andre, that you had mentioned, and it came up actually at the end of the Trump administration, when we thought there might be a 1-year extension to agree on a 1-year nuclear freeze, and maybe you can unpack that a little bit for our audience. Help me understand what sort of the Russian proposal on sort of this moratorium of deployment of item. What does this buy us? What does this temporary moratorium or even a nuclear freeze, does it give us that breathing space? Does it help to build confidence? Does it do nothing? Help me understand that as a mechanism. It obviously was part of a discussion. Andre, let me turn to you, and then Amy, I'll bring you into that question.
So those are slightly different in nature. I'll start with the moratorium. Basically, once US left the INF treaty, we didn't have any more limitations on the building and deploying those systems with the distance between 500 and 5,500 kilometers, quite a big range of systems on ground-based, based on land. So it didn't seem that US would be interested in getting back into the INF treaty or reconstructing it in any way or form. So what Russia proposed is, okay, maybe we can at least secure some of the regions of the world where we don't believe we need this competition. So if United States doesn't plan to deploy any intermediate range systems in Europe, for example, maybe we can keep Europe out of it. If United States only wants them in Asia to deter China or to do whatever, then maybe we can at least keep Europe out of this. And that seems to be the idea of moratorium. If we can keep Asia out of this, it's even better. But it seems that's where Russian thinking was going. It was proposed as a political agreement. It was not proposed as a treaty or anything you would need to ratify. But basically, since it's a prerogative of a president or the executive to deploy forces in a specific region, you don't really need Congress for that. So that's the moratorium part. The freeze came from the Trump administration. It was kind of weird, as some of the things which were coming from Trump administration. So basically, they wanted to freeze both Russian and US arsenals on existing levels, but they also wanted to verify it, which would include finding out the total number of Russian nuclear weapons. So Russia declassifying the number of its tactical nuclear weapons, non-strategic nuclear weapons, and also giving US access to the locations of those weapons to verify that this is exactly the number, and then it's not being increased. So Russia has never provided the numbers. The verification would have to be so intrusive that it would take quite a lot of time even to figure out how you can do it, even if there was political agreement between the sides, which there wasn't. So in the end, it's all ended in nothing because it was too big of a deal. What Russia was agreeing to is to freeze, but without verification. I frankly didn't think at the time that was a good idea. For one thing, US would probably not be satisfied with that. They would say that you can't trust Russia. But on the Russian side, probably it wouldn't be a good deal as well, because immediately people in the US would say Russia is violating, and there wouldn't be a way for Russia to prove it's not violating, since there is no verification provision. So I'm glad that we didn't have this freeze after all, because it probably would ended up in a disaster for both sides. But generally this, and yeah, Trump administration was basically saying we're gonna have this freeze by a political agreement. We're not going to involve Congress at any point, but we also want to have stringent verification, including, visiting your military bases and you visiting our military bases. Like, on which grounds would Russian inspectors come to US nuclear weapons production facilities? I'm not sure, and I'm not sure it was clear to the Marshall Billings at that point. But anyhow, this opened up like the whole idea of what can be done in political space without legally binding treaties. And this is something we should be thinking about. What are the limits of it? What can be included in it? What cannot include in it? Because as we've been saying, politically binding agreements would probably be part of this future arms control architecture in one way or the other.
Andre, thanks so much. Amy, I want to turn the last question to you, and it's perfectly teed up. Thank you, Andre. The role of Congress. I was actually surprised in our dialogue how much time we spent thinking about whether Congress, the Senate would ratify a new arms control treaty, whether we can get that. And in fact, some ways, Andre, what you were mentioning is trying to circumvent a process that demands bipartisanship and Congress. So Amy, how do we get a greater consensus and knowledge in Congress, not only of a process that we really haven't done very much, and it's very technical, it's very specific, but how do we build greater bipartisanship as these talks through the extension of New START begin? A lot of complex issues. What's the role of Congress here from your perch at the Congressional Research Service?
First, I want to disabuse, or that's probably not the right word. I want to poke a few holes in the idea that arms control has always been a bipartisan endeavor. People look at, and I've made these comments not usually in public, but I have data, so I try this. people look at votes on U.S. arms control on U.S.-Russian arms control agreements, and almost always they are overwhelmingly in favor of advice and consent to ratification. That, with the exception, of course, of the CTBT, which did not get its 67 votes, and New START, which was very close to, but above the 67 votes, most treaties get approved with 80, 90 votes or more. So people look at that and say it's bipartisan. But in reality, all those treaties were presented to Congress by a Republican president. So the sense that you can build bipartisan support for a treaty has a partisan underline to it. You can build that support if everybody is confident in the national security goals of the administration and supportive of the administration in general. And I don't want to try and say that this is a partisan fight, because it's not. It's just there's a lot more that goes into the vote on the treaty than just whether or not the treaty is in U.S. national security interests. So the best way, in my mind, to build bipartisan support for a treaty that is in U.S. is to build bipartisan support for the idea that you're looking at something and whether or not it's in U.S. national security interest, to set aside the other partisanship questions that come up. So often in the arms control debates, most members of Congress are not, well, as you mentioned, there's not a lot of broad-based knowledge and understanding of the arms control process. So they follow the guidance of the members who are paying attention. If you can broaden the base of understanding what the national security implications are of the treaty and get past what I like to refer to as the ping pong effect of talking points, which is a lot of what Congress does, then you're more likely to build bipartisan support for arms control. The good news is you can do that. We've seen it through the years on some agreements that you will have members who have their minds made up early, but Congress can have substantive debates on these issues and build knowledge. I don't want to disparage any of the members. They all have great interest in all the issues that they are talking about. They just don't have the resources and time to be experts on everything. So if you build the knowledge base, either starting early in the negotiations, starting early in the ratification process, we have a role in that at CRS. The think tanks have a role in that. There are lunches, there are dinners, there are presentations. You can build that knowledge base. And when members have substantive discussions, they reach substantive conclusions. So it's doable. It's been done in the past. And when you do that, you are more likely to have a bipartisan vote for the treaty because all members are operating off the same information. They won't reach the same conclusions, but they are operating off the same information is always helpful. So I always make a pitch for operating off factual-based same information, and we know that members will get their information from a number of different sources. But the bottom line is that you have to have the sense throughout the process, whether it's starting with day one in the strategic stability talks or building the substance of a treaty or bringing the treaty to the Senate, that you're working from a national security perspective. I have a great memory of the Senate hearings on the New START treaty, when the first hearing that Admiral Mullen came in to testify and immediately sat down and told the senators how long it had been since the United States had had inspectors on the ground in Russia. He immediately turned the discussion to the national security implications. And to the extent that there are lots of reasons to hold arms control discussions, bringing it back to this serves U.S. national security interests is the best way to bring the members to the same sources of information. The military will come in and tell them. The intelligence community will come in and tell them. So when you're having discussions on arms control in Congress, you will bring lots of perspectives. You will bring lots of sources of information, and members will reach lots of different conclusions. That's their jobs, to weigh it for themselves. But if it's seen as a national security goal versus any other goal you could think of, but if it's seen as a national security goal, you're more likely to have a broad-based discussion that members are all having the same discussion at the same time. There's no guarantee in any treaty debate that that will happen, but you are more likely to see congressional support for treaties, broad-based support, if you have a broad-based, fact-based discussion. I'm running out of treats over here to keep them quiet. So. But that's how it would work. You would try throughout the debate on the treaty, throughout the negotiations. During the New START treaty, members of the Senate went to Geneva and had briefings with the negotiating teams. If it's something that Congress participates in from the beginning, rather than has it presented to them at the end, you are more likely to have broad-based understanding of the substance of the treaty.
Thanks, Amy. Well, we know when we run out of, Amy runs out of dog treats, we're out of time. So I just want to wrap this up, that just to a point, as the Senate was considering the New START treaty, there was a Senate NATO National Security Group. There was an arms control observer group that you had members that were very focused on this, learning more. And of course, there's the conversation with the American people and that education about what is at stake, what are we trying to achieve? So huge, huge element there as well. Well, our time has come to an end. Let me begin by thanking Carnegie Corporation of New York for supporting our dialogue last fall, as well as this event. My many thanks to the PIR Center for their great partnership and collaboration in this conversation. My thanks to Amy and Andre. Clearly, this is tough, difficult stuff. It's technical, but it's so important for both of our countries in national security, and bringing thoughtful colleagues together to explain the other's thinking, to press, to probe. As Amy noted, this conversation got tough in many places, but we stuck to it, and hopefully we'll be providing some new thinking to both governments as they grapple with these complex issues and have a very short period of time to do it. My thanks again, Amy, Andre, to my team here at CSIS, and to our audience. Fantastic questions. Thank you so much. Stay tuned. We have a podcast, the Russian Roulette podcast, where we had two other participants talk about their participation in this dialogue. We'll have a summary of the dialogue. We'll keep on this and keep bringing that bipartisanship, Amy. It may not be possible to achieve, but we're going to keep working at it. And Andre, we'll keep in touch with you as you continue your great scholarship in the arms control world. Thank you again for joining us. Be safe and be well. Thank you.
Thank you.